The night was dark and heavy in the small Wild West town of Red Hollow. Storm clouds covered the sky, and the wind howled through the narrow streets like a warning. Lightning flashed, briefly lighting up the wooden buildings that lined the empty roads. The taverns and shops were all closed, but one small cabin at the edge of town glowed faintly with candlelight. Inside, Clara, a young woman with wide, fearful eyes, pressed herself against the wall. Her hands shook as she clutched the small bundle of clothes she had packed in a rush. She could hear the storm outside, but it was not the wind or the rain that made her heart pound. It was the knowledge that someone was coming for her. Someone who would not stop until he got what he wanted. She whispered to herself, almost begging, "Please, please, don't take my baby." The words barely left her lips before a sharp crash of thunder made her jump. Every shadow in the room seemed alive, and every creak of the wooden floor outside her cabin made her stomach twist with fear. She had spent nights imagining this moment, preparing for it. But now that it was here, the reality was far worse than anything she had imagined. Her mind raced as she remembered the day she had first met Judge Dalton. At first, he had seemed like a protector, a man of power who could keep the town safe. But over time, his true nature had become clear. Cold, cunning, and cruel, he had no interest in justice. His eyes had always held a hunger, and Clara now understood that hunger was for something far more personal, her unborn child. She had heard whispers in the town about what he wanted, and her blood had run cold. She knew she could not trust anyone else, and she could not run to the townspeople for help. Many of them feared Dalton, and those who did not were too weak to resist him. That left her alone, hiding in the shadows, hoping against hope that she could escape the fate that waited for her. As she peeked through the window, the wind blew the branches of the nearby trees violently, and she thought she saw a shadow moving. Her breath caught in her throat. The shadow was tall, commanding, and unmistakable. Judge Dalton was coming. She had no idea how he had learned her exact location, but he had. Every step he took toward the cabin was measured and deliberate. The sound of his boots on the wet dirt outside made her chest tighten. Clara's fingers shook as she unlatched the small trapdoor she had found in the corner of the room. It led to a narrow crawl space, dusty and filled with cobwebs, but it might be her only way out. She pushed the heavy wooden plank aside and peered down into the darkness. She could barely see, but she could feel that it went deep enough to hide her from prying eyes. Clara took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had packed a few essentials: a small knife, a bit of dried food, and a blanket. But she knew that these things would not matter if she was caught. Her mind went over every plan she had ever made. Escape through the woods? Too risky. Dalton knew them as well as she did. Hide in the cellar? Only if he didn't search every corner of her cabin. She bit her lip, thinking furiously. She had to make a decision now because every second that passed brought Dalton closer. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, almost as if nature itself was warning her to act. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the shadow of the man outside, his long coat dripping with rain. He stopped for a moment and looked directly at her cabin, as though he could see inside. Clara's heart leapt into her throat. Was he really that powerful, or was it just her fear playing tricks on her mind? Suddenly, the door to the cabin creaked. Clara froze, her breath shallow. She had hidden every trace of herself, but someone, or something, was already inside. The sound of heavy boots moving across the wooden floor echoed through the room. Panic surged through her, and she scrambled toward the trapdoor. As she slid open the wooden cover and lowered herself into the narrow space below, she felt the rough would scrape her palms. Darkness enveloped her, and the sound of her own heartbeat seemed deafening. From above, she could hear Dalton's voice, low and menacing, calling her name. "Clara, you cannot hide from me." The words made her shiver. He knew her, every fear she had, every secret passage she had found, and he had still come. Clara crawled as fast as she could, her small body twisting through the narrow passage. Her hands and knees scraped against the dirt and stone, but she ignored the pain. She could hear the man moving above her, the sound of his search methodical and cruel. Every step, Every whisper of his voice made her pulse race. She had to stay calm. She had to survive. She thought of her baby, of the tiny life inside her, and of the dreams she still held for the future. She could not let Dalton win. Not now, not ever. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she felt the tunnel slope downward. A small light flickered ahead, and she realized she might actually have a way out. She took one final deep breath and pushed herself forward into the unknown, praying that her courage would be enough to face the danger that waited above. The storm continued to rage, the wind and rain lashing against the cabin. But in the darkness below, Clara felt a small spark of hope. She was still alive, still moving, and still fighting. The night was far from over, and Judge Dalton would not give up easily. But for now, she had a chance, and that chance was all she needed. Every heartbeat, every cautious step, was a small victory against the overwhelming darkness. And as she crawled forward, the audience could feel the tension, the fear, and the hope building, knowing that the true story was only just beginning, and that Clara's courage would be tested in ways she had never imagined. Clara moved cautiously through the narrow underground passage, the damp earth and cold stone pressing against her as she inched forward. Every step was careful, every breath shallow, because she knew that above her, Judge Dalton and his men were searching relentlessly. The storm outside hammered the roof of the cabin, masking the noises of her movements but also adding a layer of urgency. She remembered the day she had first learned the truth about Dalton. At first, he had appeared as a protector, a respected figure in Red Hollow who kept order and justice. But over time, his true nature had been revealed. He was not a man who valued law or fairness. He valued power and control, and nothing terrified Clara more than the realization that he desired her unborn child. She had heard whispers around the town, stories of his dark ambition to claim the child for reasons that were unclear but certainly sinister. Now, those stories were real, and the shadow of that threat loomed over her every move. Her mind raced, trying to figure out how to escape the town and protect the life inside her. She knew Dalton's influence extended far beyond the cabin. The whole town was afraid of him, and many had been forced to obey his cruel demands. As she crawled further, Clara thought about her limited options. Going into the forest was risky. The paths were familiar to Dalton and his men, and she had no way of knowing whether they had set traps along the way. The nearby river could be used to throw off pursuit, but crossing it without being seen would be nearly impossible. She paused for a moment in the tunnel, listening to the sounds above. Footsteps, voices, whispers. Dalton's presence was everywhere, like a shadow that could not be escaped. Clara swallowed hard and pushed herself forward, her body scraped and aching, but determination burning inside her. She would not allow fear to paralyze her. She had to think strategically, to use every bit of cleverness and courage she possessed. She could not simply run. She had to survive with a plan, and that plan had to keep her baby safe above all else. The passage opened slightly into a small underground chamber, where remnants of old supplies and forgotten belongings were stacked against the walls. Clara paused, catching her breath and scanning the room for anything useful. She found a short, sturdy rope, a small lantern with just enough oil to last an hour, and a few pieces of dry bread and jerky that could sustain her for the journey ahead. She tucked them carefully into her cloak and began to think about her next steps. The wind howled outside, carrying the distant sound of Dalton's voice calling her name. The words were cruel, threatening, and deliberate, meant to terrorize her. "Clara, you cannot hide from me. The child will be mine." She shivered at the sound, but she refused to give in. Her instincts told her that he was growing impatient, that his obsession with her child made him reckless. That recklessness might be the only chance she had. Creeping forward, Clara considered another path she had discovered months earlier, an abandoned network of tunnels that led toward the edge of town and eventually into the dense forest. Few people remembered it, and Dalton likely did not know all of its twists and turns. She had mapped it out in her mind long ago, imagining that one day it might be her only way to escape. Now that day had arrived. She took a deep breath and began navigating the twisting corridors, each step echoing softly in the darkness. Shadows danced along the rough stone walls as the lantern's flame flickered, creating shapes that looked almost alive. Clara forced herself to stay calm, focusing on the path ahead rather than the fear gnawing at her heart. She could hear Dalton's men above, still searching the cabin, still calling her name. They would not stop until they found her. She had to move fast. Suddenly, she heard a faint sound ahead, not the echo of her own movements, but something else, something deliberate. She froze. Was it another person? Or was it one of Dalton's men who had discovered her trail? The tension made her muscles tighten, and her breath came in quick bursts. She considered hiding in the shadows, but the space was too small. There was nowhere to hide safely. Then, a soft voice whispered from the darkness. "Clara? It's me. Don't be afraid." She recognized it instantly. Ethan, a mysterious drifter who had recently arrived in Red Hollow. He had a reputation for being a skilled tracker and fighter, someone who had his own reasons for despising Dalton. Clara's heart lifted slightly, hope replacing some of her fear. Ethan guided her through the last stretch of tunnels, leading her toward a hidden exit into the forest. She dared to look up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and disbelief. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself a small measure of hope. But even as she stepped into the cool, wet night air, she knew their journey was far from over. The forest was dark and full of unseen dangers, and Dalton would not give up easily. His obsession with her child would drive him to pursue them through anything. Clara held her cloak tighter around her, feeling the baby move gently within her. That small life was now her reason to fight, her reason to survive. With Ethan by her side, she took a careful step into the shadows of the trees, each one stretching tall and menacing under the stormy sky. The wind howled around them, carrying the distant sound of Dalton's anger, but Clara felt a strange mix of fear and determination. She knew that the night ahead would test every ounce of courage she had, and that the chase through the forest was only the beginning. Still, with each step, she grew more resolved. She would not allow Dalton to take her child. She would fight, she would hide, and she would survive. And as the storm raged above, the audience could feel the suspense growing, knowing that the true danger had only just begun, and that Clara's courage would be tested in ways she could never have imagined. Clara and Ethan moved silently through the dense forest, the rain soaking their clothes and the mud threatening to pull them down with every step. The trees were thick and twisted, their branches scraping against their faces, and the shadows seemed to reach for them in the dim light of the stormy night. Clara's heart raced, not just from fear, but from the realization that every sound could betray them. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig could alert Dalton's men to their position. Ethan led the way, his eyes sharp and alert, scanning the surroundings as if he could read the forest like a map. He was quiet, speaking only when necessary, and his calm presence gave Clara a strange sense of safety amidst the chaos. She clutched her cloak around her belly, feeling the life inside her and remembering the reason she had to survive. With every step, the forest grew darker, more menacing, and the distant sounds of Dalton's pursuit reminded them that there was no turning back. Ethan whispered instructions in a low voice, guiding her along hidden paths that twisted like mazes, avoiding open spaces where they could be spotted. Clara followed closely, trusting him even though she barely knew him, because the alternative, facing Dalton alone, was far worse than the unknown risk of following a stranger. As they moved deeper into the forest, Clara allowed herself a moment to observe Ethan. He was not like the townspeople she had known, hard-eyed, cautious, but kind in the way he acted. His past was a mystery, and she knew little about him, but he had appeared at the perfect moment, saving her from Dalton's grasp. She realized that he had his own reasons for hating the judge, reasons that aligned with her need to survive. The thought gave her a flicker of hope in a situation that seemed hopeless. But hope was dangerous. The storm raged on, lightning flashing across the sky and thunder shaking the ground. Every shadow in the forest seemed alive, and Clara could not shake the feeling that Dalton was closer than they imagined. She imagined his face, cold and relentless, and the cruel words he had spoken about wanting her child. The anger and fear twisted inside her, giving her the determination to keep moving. She had to stay ahead, to survive, and to protect the baby no matter what. Suddenly, a distant shout broke the rhythm of the storm. There! There this way! Dalton's men had discovered part of their trail, and Clara's heart lurched. Ethan grabbed her hand firmly, pulling her into a cluster of thick bushes just as a shadow moved past where they had just been. The rain masked their presence, but not completely. Every second counted, and they had to think fast. Ethan whispered a plan. They would follow the creek deeper into the forest, where the water would hide their tracks, and eventually, they would reach a place where Dalton would not dare follow. Clara nodded, her teeth chattering from cold and fear, but she obeyed without hesitation. The creek was treacherous, slippery, and the current strong, but they pressed forward, balancing on rocks and wading through shallow pools, careful to leave no sign behind. With each step, Clara's confidence grew. She realized that surviving was not just about hiding. It was about being clever, watching every movement, thinking ahead, and trusting someone when every instinct screamed to run alone. Hours passed as they navigated the forest, the storm beginning to fade into a drizzling rain. Clara's clothes were soaked, her muscles ached, and her hands were raw from gripping branches and rocks. Yet she felt alive, more alive than she had in months of hiding and fearing. Ethan guided her to a narrow ledge overlooking the town, and for the first time, she could see the tiny lights of Red Hollow flickering below. Dalton's figure was visible in the distance, moving like a predator scanning the land, but he did not see them. The relief was brief, however, because they both knew that visibility could not last forever. Dalton would stop at nothing to claim her child, and their path to safety was still long and uncertain. Clara realized that she had not only found an ally but a companion who could help her face the trials ahead. With Ethan beside her, she felt a new sense of determination. They were no longer two helpless people running blindly. They were a team, thinking, planning, and moving together. As they descended the slope and continued along hidden forest paths, Clara began to notice small signs of life and safety. A hollow tree where they could rest, a narrow path that led to an abandoned cabin she had heard of in stories. Each clue made her hope rise slightly, and yet she kept her fear close, knowing that Dalton's obsession made him unpredictable. She whispered to Ethan about her plan to reach the cabin, and he nodded in agreement, his eyes sharp and watchful. They moved silently, the forest around them a maze of shadow and rain, but the bond forming between them gave Clara courage. She realized that sometimes survival depended not just on fear, but on trust, strategy, and the willingness to accept help when it came. And as the night stretched on, the audience could feel the tension growing, knowing that Dalton's pursuit was relentless, that danger was never far, and that Clara's journey through the forest with Ethan was only the beginning of a long and suspenseful struggle to protect her child. Clara and Ethan pressed on through the dark forest, the sound of the wind mingling with the distant echoes of Judge Dalton's angry shouts. Every shadow seemed to move, and every snap of a twig made Clara's heart leap into her throat. The forest was dense, with thick undergrowth and towering trees that blocked even the faint moonlight, making each step a careful calculation. Ethan led the way, his eyes sharp, scanning for any danger, and his hand never left Clara's shoulder as if to remind her that she was not alone. They moved quickly, balancing on wet rocks, ducking under low branches, and wading through small streams, each obstacle slowing them but also giving them a chance to hide their tracks. Behind them, they could hear the relentless pursuit of Dalton's men, their boots pounding against the mud, their voices carrying through the trees like a storm of their own. Clara's muscles ached, her cloak was soaked, and the rain had turned the path into a slippery, dangerous course, yet she forced herself to keep moving. Every step was a fight against exhaustion, fear, and the growing knowledge that Dalton would not stop for anything. As they ran, Clara's mind worked furiously to think of ways to outsmart the judge and his posse. She remembered a river that cut through the forest, wide and fast-moving, where she could use the current to cover their escape. Ethan suggested taking it slowly, balancing on the rocks that jutted out from the water, and jumping carefully from one to another. The plan was risky, One slip could mean injury or capture, but Clara knew there was no other choice. She held her breath as she stepped onto the first rock, testing its stability, and then leapt to the next. Ethan followed closely, steadying her when her foot slipped on the wet surface. Behind them, the shouts of Dalton's men grew louder, and the sound of splashing water indicated that some of them had dared to follow. Clara's heart raced, not just with fear, but with determination. She could not let anyone take her child. Each leap across the river was a small victory, a moment where courage overcame fear. The audience could feel the tension rising with every careful step, knowing that a single mistake could change everything. The forest presented more obstacles as they moved forward. Fallen trees blocked their path, forcing them to crawl or climb, while thick vines seemed to grab at their clothes and hair. At one point, a sudden roar echoed from the darkness. A startled bear that had been driven from its den by the storm. Clara froze, her mind spinning with panic, but Ethan whispered calmly, signaling her to stay low and move slowly. Together, they managed to skirt the bear, the danger of nature adding another layer of suspense to their already tense flight. Each time they thought they had found a small moment of safety, Dalton's presence reminded them that the threat was far from over. His obsession with the child made him relentless, and his men were equally determined, scouring every inch of the forest with cruel precision. The audience could feel the chase pressing in from every direction, the suspense building as Clara and Ethan navigated each new danger with grit and cunning. Hours seemed to pass in the forest, though the storm had begun to subside. The rain turned into a steady drizzle, the wind less fierce, but the forest remained dark and treacherous. Clara's body ached, her arms scraped from branches, her legs heavy from running, but she refused to give in to fatigue. Ethan guided her to a small ridge overlooking a narrow valley, where the ground sloped downward into a series of rocky cliffs. From there, they could see faint lights flickering in the distance, Dalton's men searching tirelessly for them. Ethan pointed out a hidden path that led along the cliffside, a risky but faster route to the edge of the forest. Clara's stomach twisted with fear, knowing that a misstep could send them plunging to their deaths. Yet she agreed. There was no other way. They inched along the narrow ledge, clinging to roots and rocks, moving as quietly as possible. Every sound of cracking stone or shifting dirt made their hearts pound. Even the slightest mistake could give away their location to Dalton and endanger the baby. Finally, they reached a small clearing where the forest thinned, revealing an abandoned cabin that Clara had heard of as a child. It was a place of old refuge, forgotten by most, and it offered a temporary haven from the relentless pursuit. Clara and Ethan collapsed inside, gasping for breath, the adrenaline slowly fading as they realized they had survived the worst part of the chase. Outside, the forest seemed quieter, though they knew Dalton's pursuit was not over. They had bought themselves a moment of safety, but the journey ahead was far from finished. Clara wrapped her arms around her belly, feeling the baby move, and allowed herself a brief sigh of relief. She knew they were not safe yet, but having a place to hide, even temporarily, gave her the courage to plan the next steps. The audience could feel a sense of tension mixed with hope. The chase was dangerous, suspenseful, and relentless, but Clara and Ethan had survived through clever thinking, courage, and teamwork. The story had reached a turning point, where fear was still present but so was the possibility of triumph. The night was far from over, and Dalton's obsession still threatened everything. But for now, Clara had a chance to fight another day, and the audience was left eager to see how the next chapter of her escape and survival would unfold. Clara and Ethan finally arrived at the hidden safe haven, a small abandoned cabin deep in the forest that time had forgotten. The roof sagged under years of neglect, and the wooden walls creaked ominously with every gust of wind. Rain still drizzled softly outside, and the trees swayed, casting long shadows through the broken windows. For a brief moment, Clara allowed herself to relax, feeling the rough wooden floor beneath her exhausted hands and the temporary safety of being out of immediate danger. But the feeling of relief was fleeting because both she and Ethan knew that Judge Dalton would not stop. His obsession with her child made him relentless, and his cunning meant that he could discover even the most hidden places if given enough time. Clara's heart still raced as she scanned the cabin, looking for anything that could help them fortify their temporary refuge. Ethan moved quietly beside her, checking the broken doors and shuttered windows, whispering reassurances while keeping a watchful eye on the surrounding forest. Even in the momentary calm, the tension never left their shoulders. Every creak and whisper of the wind reminded them that danger was never far away. Inside the cabin, they found remnants of past inhabitants, old blankets, dried food, and a small pile of supplies that might sustain them for a day or two. Clara hurriedly arranged the materials, using what she could to make a crude barricade against intruders. She placed a few sharp sticks near the entrances, hoping to slow anyone who dared to follow them, while Ethan set up a rudimentary alarm using tin cans and string. Every little measure mattered because Dalton's men were skilled trackers, and even the smallest sound could alert them to the cabin's location. Clara wrapped herself tightly around her cloak, feeling the baby move gently, as if sensing the danger in the world outside. She whispered softly to the child, promising that she would protect them no matter what. The audience could feel the anxiety building. Here was a moment of quiet, but it was loaded with suspense because everyone watching knew Dalton's shadow loomed near, ready to strike at any moment. Hours passed, and the storm began to calm, leaving the forest wet and quiet. Clara and Ethan stayed alert, taking turns keeping watch while the other rested. Ethan shared small details about his past, his voice low and steady, and Clara realized that he was not just a skilled tracker, but a man who had suffered at the hands of men like Dalton. His presence gave her courage, a sense that she was not alone in this battle. As night deepened, the wind rustled the broken shutters, making Clara jump. She could almost hear Dalton's voice carried on the wind, calling her name, taunting her, reminding her that he would not give up. She gritted her teeth, refusing to let fear control her, knowing that every moment of calm could be shattered in an instant. The tension in the cabin was palpable, the silence heavy, and the audience could feel the suspense rising as every small noise seemed magnified in the quiet. Suddenly, a faint movement outside caught Ethan's attention. He signaled Clara to stay low and whispered that Dalton's men were nearby, perhaps scouting the area after the chase earlier. Clara's breath caught in her throat, and she felt a chill run down her spine. They were safe, but only for now, and any misstep could mean capture. Ethan motioned for her to move to a small hidden corner of the cabin where they could observe without being seen. Through the broken slats, they could see shadows flitting through the trees. The audience could feel the tension spike. Would they be discovered now, after surviving so much? Clara's hands shook slightly as she held onto Ethan's arm, but his steady presence reassured her. They had survived Dalton's pursuit so far, but the final challenge was still ahead, and the forest offered no guarantees. While waiting in the cabin, Clara began to formulate a plan. She knew they could not stay here forever. Dalton would search methodically until he found them, and hiding was no longer enough. They needed a strategy, a way to outsmart him once and for all. She whispered her thoughts to Ethan, and together they considered the options. Using the terrain to their advantage, creating traps, and preparing for a confrontation that might finally end the danger. Every decision carried weight, and every action could be the difference between life and death. Yet amidst the fear and tension, Clara felt a spark of determination. She was no longer just running. She was preparing to fight, to protect her child, and to face Dalton with courage. The audience could sense the rising anticipation, knowing that the next part of the story would lead to a climax, where bravery, cleverness, and hope would collide with danger, and where the suspense would reach its peak. As the night wore on, the cabin became a temporary sanctuary, a place where Clara could gather strength and courage. She watched the shadows move outside, the faint sounds of the forest reminding her that danger was always near, but she also felt a growing confidence. With Ethan by her side, and her determination unbroken, she knew they could survive what was coming. The audience was left hanging on every detail, aware that the final confrontation was near, and eager to see how Clara and Ethan would face the ultimate test against Judge Dalton. The tension, the suspense, and the hope all intertwined in that quiet, battered cabin. creating a perfect stage for the dramatic events that would unfold in the next part of the story. As dawn approached, the forest remained shrouded in mist, the early morning light barely piercing through the thick trees. Clara and Ethan emerged cautiously from the cabin, their movements silent and deliberate, knowing that Judge Dalton was close behind. The distant echo of his angry voice carried through the valley, mixing with the soft sounds of birds beginning to stir and the gentle rustle of leaves. Every step felt heavy, yet necessary, because the confrontation they had feared for so long was inevitable. Dalton's obsession with Clara's child had driven him to madness, and now, standing on a narrow cliff path with steep drops on either side, it was clear that the final showdown would decide everything. Ethan kept close to Clara, his hand on her shoulder, guiding her along the dangerous path while keeping his eyes trained on the forest below, where Dalton and his men emerged like predators seeking their prey. Clara's heart pounded, fear and adrenaline mingling, but she felt a growing sense of determination. She could not let Dalton succeed. Not now, not ever. Every lesson she had learned, every moment of courage she had summoned, had led to this point. Dalton appeared suddenly at the far end of the path, his long coat soaked with morning dew, his face twisted with anger and cruelty. He raised a hand, signaling to his men, who fanned out on either side of the cliff path, attempting to corner Clara and Ethan. The air was tense, every movement charged with danger, and the audience could feel the suspense rising with every heartbeat. Clara stepped forward, clutching her child protectively, and whispered to Ethan that they had to act carefully. They could not fight recklessly, for one mistake could mean falling from the cliff or being captured. Ethan nodded, his eyes scanning for anything they could use to their advantage. The forest offered natural weapons, loose rocks, sturdy branches, and vines that could be used to trip or entangle Dalton's men. Clara felt a surge of courage. This was the moment to use both her wits and bravery, and she would not fail. Dalton shouted, demanding the child, his voice echoing with fury and menace. Clara's response was silent but firm. She tightened her hold on the baby and stepped closer to Ethan, signaling that they were ready. Ethan made the first move, using a fallen branch to sweep at one of the approaching men, sending him stumbling backward. Clara grabbed a small rock and threw it strategically to distract another. The sound of clashing wood and shouted orders filled the cliffside as Dalton's men rushed toward them. But the narrow path worked to Clara and Ethan's advantage. Dalton could not send all his men at once without risking a fall. Clara found a vine hanging from a nearby tree and tied it to a jagged rock, creating a trap that caused two of Dalton's men to tumble over the edge with startled screams. The tension was unbearable, the suspense gripping the audience as every move could determine life or death. Finally, Dalton himself stepped forward, fury blazing in his eyes. He lunged at Ethan with a drawn knife, and the two clashed violently, each strike echoing across the cliffside. Clara, though terrified, knew she could not stand by. She used a small stone to knock Dalton's balance, and with a quick, desperate push, she sent him staggering backward. His coat snagged on a tree branch, tipping him dangerously over the cliff's edge. He grasped at the air, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, and for a long moment, it seemed as though time had stopped. Then, with a final cry of anger, Dalton fell, disappearing into the misty forest below. Silence settled over the cliff, broken only by the sound of Clara's ragged breathing and the wind rustling through the trees. The audience could feel the weight of the moment. The villain was defeated, the threat eliminated, and justice had finally been served. Exhausted but alive, Clara sank to the ground, holding her child close as Ethan knelt beside her. The danger was over, and for the first time in many nights, she allowed herself to feel relief. The sun rose slowly, golden light spilling across the valley and illuminating the forest with warmth and hope. The fear, tension, and suspense of the past hours gave way to a sense of triumph. Clara looked at Ethan, gratitude and relief shining in her eyes, knowing that they had survived not just through strength, but through trust, courage, and clever thinking. The forest that had seemed so threatening just hours before now appeared beautiful and full of promise. The audience could feel the emotional payoff, the tension giving way to joy and satisfaction. Clara had protected her child, outsmarted a cruel and dangerous man, and found a loyal companion in Ethan. The stage was set for the final resolution, a moment where the suspense faded and the story's moral could shine through, leaving viewers fulfilled and eager for the happy ending to come. After the chaos of the chase and the confrontation, Clara and Ethan finally found a moment of calm in the early morning light. The forest around them was quiet, birds chirping softly, and the storm had passed, leaving fresh rain glistening on leaves and stones. Clara held her child close, feeling the gentle movement of the tiny life she had fought so hard to protect. Her arms ached, her body was bruised and exhausted, but the relief and joy of survival filled her heart. She looked at Ethan, whose face reflected the same mixture of exhaustion and triumph, and for the first time, she smiled freely. They had faced danger, fear, and relentless pursuit, and yet they had survived together. The hidden cabin that had once been a place of temporary safety now felt like a true sanctuary. Clara realized that courage, cleverness, and the willingness to trust others had made this happy ending possible. Ethan had been her guide, her protector, and her ally, but she had also discovered her own strength, a strength she had never known she possessed. The audience could feel the warmth and relief in this moment, the tension of the story melting into a sense of peace and satisfaction. Clara knew that life in Red Hollow would never be the same. The town had feared Dalton for years, and now, with his threat gone, there was a chance for healing and renewal. She imagined the townspeople slowly regaining their courage, inspired by her bravery and determination to protect her child. Ethan stayed close, offering quiet reassurances and sharing in the joy of the new day. Together, they planned a safer life, one that allowed them to live without the constant fear that had dominated their nights for so long. Clara wrapped her cloak around her baby and whispered promises of love and protection, her voice steady despite the lingering adrenaline. She felt a deep sense of gratitude not just for survival, but for the lessons the experience had taught her. She had learned that fear could be faced, that obstacles could be overcome with intelligence and courage, and that even in the darkest moments, hope could guide the way. As they stepped out of the forest into the open fields bathed in golden sunlight, Clara looked back one last time. The trees, once dark and threatening, now seemed alive with beauty and possibility. She knew that life would still have challenges, but she also knew that she had the strength to face them. Ethan smiled at her, a quiet understanding passing between them that they were stronger together. The audience could feel the resolution of the story, the suspense replaced with warmth, triumph, and hope. The chase was over, the villain defeated, and the hero's journey had reached its natural conclusion. Clara's bravery and determination had created a safe future for her child, and in doing so, had inspired anyone who might hear her story to find courage in their own lives. The moral of Clara's story became clear as she walked through the fields with Ethan and her child. Life would always have dangers and obstacles, some cruel and unexpected, like Judge Dalton, but courage, clever thinking, and trust in the right allies could overcome even the most relentless threats. The audience could feel this lesson resonate. Never give up, never underestimate your own strength, and always protect what you love. Even when fear seems overwhelming, there is always a way to survive and succeed, as long as determination and heart guide your actions. Clara's journey from fear and despair to triumph and hope was a testament to these truths, leaving viewers with a sense of inspiration and satisfaction that lingered long after the story ended. As the sun rose fully, lighting up the valley with golden warmth, Clara turned toward the audience and thought, a soft smile on her face. She wanted them to remember her story, to carry its message into their own lives. She whispered a final message, as if speaking directly to every viewer. Courage, wisdom, and love can overcome the darkest of threats. Protect what matters most, and trust in yourself to face any challenge. And then, with a gentle nod, she added, if you enjoyed this adventure, subscribe to our channel for more epic stories of bravery and hope. Share this story so others can feel the courage, the suspense, and the triumph too. The audience was left with a full sense of closure, satisfaction, and inspiration, knowing that Clara's journey had come to a happy ending, and that the lessons she learned would stay with them long after the last scene faded.